For our second Widening the Pipeline virtual training session of 2024, when the White House celebrated Native American Heritage Month for the very first time in November of 2023, our next speaker had a front row seat for this historic event. Pauly Denetclaw is a political correspondent with Indian Country Today. She has covered state, tribal, and national elections, and she maintained a database of 2022 Indigenous candidates. Pauly has also covered Indigenous members of Congress, as well as key legislations and hearings and Supreme Court cases. She's reported for the Navajo Times and the Texas Observer, covering Indigenous communities. And her radio pieces have aired on National Native News, NPR's Latino USA, and Texas Public Radio. Pauly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. First, I just want to introduce myself in my language. Yaat a Pauly Denetclaw Yinashia Halson Ishland Kia Ani Bashashin Bit Ani Dashache Do Shian Dashanella Kin Hojona Dant Nasha. Hi everyone. My name is Pauly Denetclaw. I'm Meadow People, born for Towering House People. I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I'm originally from Manuelito, New Mexico, where I was born and raised. And so I'm just really excited and happy to be here with you all today and to share this space and share a little bit of my knowledge with you all.
I have to say how powerful that just was for me when I think about who is covering major policy issues in this year to an Indigenous journalist as a part of the mix. So thank you so much for being here with us and for doing the work that you do. Let's start a little bit more learning about your background in that I would love to find out how journalism came into your life and why you decided you wanted to be a journalist.
Yeah. So, um, I grew up in a household where my dad got magazines, the newspaper every single day. Our home was filled with books. And so it was very common for me to grow up in a household. My parents watched the news every single morning, the local news and national news. And so being very informed through journalism was really important in my household. And so I think that that's in of itself set a strong foundation for journalism. And that was really my introduction, was just seeing my parents be media consumers to consume the news. They were extremely like, they would have, debates about things, and they would talk about policy. And my mom was a legislative advisor for our nation. So she worked for the legislative branch for the Navajo Nation and was helping our council delegates, which are basically like a House of Representatives, craft policy for my nation. And so I just grew up in a household that, this was daily conversations that we had. And as I got older, um, I will say this, I say this all the time. I think that Gilmore Girls created an entire generation of female journalists, and I wanted to be like Rory Gilmore. I watched her from when I was like 12 years old all the way up until I was 17. And, I watched the entire series and I wanted to be just like her. And I remember when Christiane Amanpour was on Gilmore Girls, because that was somebody that she deeply admired. And because Rory deeply admired her, I deeply admired her and I followed her work. And so I think that that's really where the idea for becoming a journalist came from, was just from watching Rory Gilmore. And so from there, I was sitting at 17 years old, sitting at my laptop, and I was on the eve of my graduation and from high school at that time. And I, talked about three different paths that I could take. I could be my uncle studies infectious diseases at Berkeley. And so I have a very like weird interest in viruses and diseases. And so I was just this little girl doing projects on all of these different viruses for my science classes. And I was just very interested in viruses. And my uncle studied hantavirus at Berkeley. And so I was like, I could do that. This is the path that I could take. I could go to these universities. I could do that. I could work with my uncle in his lab and also study hantavirus with him. I'm like, that's something that I could do. My dad really wanted me to be a lawyer. I was part of our debate. I was captain of our debate team at my high school. And so my dad really wanted me to be a lawyer. He's like, I think you can do it. You're smart enough. Like, you are so passionate. And I just, and then the last option that I had was I was like, but my dream job is to be a journalist. And I want to write and I want to report and I just want to be around people and I I want to do this, but I don't think that I can because I grew up in a small town in rural New Mexico and being sort of at a national news outlet at that time, I wanted to work for Time magazine because of a story that they wrote about young girls who were going through puberty at a younger and younger age. And it was so interesting because also being a girl, going through that, I was like now reading stories about that in Time magazine, which was very impactful for me. Um, and so that's why I wanted to be in Time magazine and be a magazine writer. Um, but I just didn't think that I could do it. And I was really lucky that after my first semester, when I did not do very well in biology, that I was like, oh, this is not for me. And I don't really like this. So I switched into journalism the year after that. And I told my mom that. And my mom has always been really supportive of me. And so there's a journalist that she used to send um, the agendas for our tribe's meetings to. And so she reached out to her and was like, my daughter wants to be a journalist. Can she follow you around for a day to see what journalists do? And from there, the CEO and publisher of Navajo Times said that it was a hazard, not like a hazard, but like um, I couldn't do that because of HR stuff and like, you know, making sure that I'm safe and other people around me are safe. And so he's like, you can't do that, but you can apply for an internship. And so I applied for an internship at Navajo Times and I spent the summer writing and reporting in my community. And it was the most incredible thing I've ever done. I was carrying C-section, which is our arts and culture section for our paper. So I had like 3 to 5 stories every single week that published. And it was amazing. It was such an amazing opportunity to be in my community and to talk to people from my nation. And after that, I got, I've only ever worked in journalism. So it's been a really incredible experience. And I'm really happy that I'm where I'm at because I always dreamed of, covering politics. It's something that I've wanted to do ever since I was a teenager. And the fact that I get to do that now is really amazing.
Pauly, I could listen to you talking. I swear this is the most inspirational conversation I have had this year. So I want to pivot from that wonderful introduction to an issue that we've been talking about in so many of our Widening the Pipeline sessions, and that is how we bring our lived experience into various spaces. So you had this incredible opportunity to learn about policy and that from your nation and from your parents and that sort of connection. Tell us about the first time you entered a space where you were the only woman of color, the only person of color, and it was a policy setting. What was that experience like for you?
So I think that I was very fortunate and very lucky that even today, when I go and I cover various events, I even though I may be the only journalist there who is a woman of color, I'm not the only Native woman in the room because the folks that are there are like people from who are Indigenous. A lot of them are Native women and being around and seeing powerful Native women, giving testimony at Congress, speaking to leaders, who are going to the Hill. Um, I think it makes my experience a little bit different. And even when I went to the White House, and I covered the Native American Heritage Month event, I was in a room surrounded by my community. And, there were people who I hadn't seen in a really long time who were in that space with me. Um, and people who I knew who were mutuals on social media, and I met them for the first time there. And so I have been very fortunate that I've actually never really had to feel alone in a space. And I have done that strategically in that I worked for Navajo Times, and our newsroom was mostly Navajo women. From there, I went to National Native News, where my supervisor was a Navajo woman, and she taught me everything that I know about, reporting. And when I would go with her on reporting trips, like she would be with me. So again, I wasn't like a loner by myself. And she's so fearless and so incredible. And she would just like get in there and be like, Pauly, this is how you do it. And I'm like, ah! So I'm just like following behind her like a little chick, like, oh my gosh. And she is just like, she is so incredible. And she's still one of the most amazing like journalists I know. And then after that, I went to Generation Justice, which is a media project in Albuquerque. And again, there, the focus was creating a pipeline of journalists of color into media. And so I was again surrounded by other journalists of color, other women of color in this field. And from there, I went to back to Navajo Times, where I worked for 3 years. And then after that, I was at uh, the Texas Observer. Yeah, I was at the Texas Observer. And I think that was probably the only experience I really had. There were other women of color at that organization, but I was the only Native American woman who worked in that newsroom, the only Indigenous woman in that newsroom. And I think that that experience is probably the only one where I realized how different my experiences from other people of color, in that I not only was I experiencing sort of erasure from, white folks, but also from other people of color who didn't really understand Indigenous issues. And so I will say this, I did feel very alone. I felt extremely alone in that space, in that nobody understood me. Nobody could support me because nobody was doing what I was doing. They had no experience in covering Indigenous nations at all. And so I was the only person, besides obviously the editor-in-chief, Tristan Ottone, um, who is Indigenous as well, but he is also a man, which makes things a little bit different. And so I I did feel extremely alone. And that was very challenging for me to be in that space, also away from home for the first time. I am a huge, like, obviously, I'm just like a classic Indigenous person where I grew up in my community, I worked in my community, I didn't leave my family's home until I moved to Texas. And it was hard. It was very, very hard for me. And being somebody who is not only away from your nation, not only out of the four sacred mountains, um, but I was in a newsroom where I didn't feel supported, and having to navigate that was very challenging, but also brought so much strength and resiliency to me. And I eventually, they were just looking, in my opinion, were looking for a reason to get rid of me. And so they fired me at the Texas Observer because I was very outspoken and I was filing reports. And I'm a tattletale. I will always say that. And I'm not afraid to talk about things. Um, and so I, yeah. And after that, it was like the most traumatic experience of my life. Like, I could not believe that I didn't have a job. I didn't know how I was going to pay my rent. But that's when I really realized that having a strong network in journalism is really powerful. And I leveraged that. And I was able to do freelance work for 3 months. And it was incredible. And exactly, journalism.
Listen,
Exactly.
I've got to tell you that when you just said that it was a difficult experience, but it gave you so much power and gave you so much energy. I want the fellows to carve that onto your brain. If this industry, if this business is meant for you, those kinds of experiences uh, literally can be the difference between moving forward and not in terms of building your strength, building that skin. And so thank you for sharing that with us. Um, let's talk about, there's so much I want to ask you, but let's talk about preparing for the Native American Heritage Month celebration last year. I know that Indigenous journalists from uh, what was formerly known as the Native American Journalism Association, now you're the Indigenous Journalists Association, but you were involved in conversations with White House staff. Tell us a little bit about how this came about.
Yeah, so in Indian country is very small. The indigenous community is extremely small. And and so how I got into this event is my editor-in-chief, Jordan Bennett Begay. She's been reporting here in DC for the last, I think it's been almost 6 years now. And before that, she was the only reporter here. She was a reporter producer here before she became managing editor and then editor-in-chief. And so she was well connected to someone in the White House who invited her to the Native American Heritage Month event. And she reached out to them and was like, Pauly has to be in this room. Like she has to be here. She has to like be able to report from here. Like this is such a monumental event that she has to be in the room. And, you know, the person that she contacted is also Indigenous and was like, okay, I'll see what I can do. And that's how I was able to get into that event. And I was really, really happy that I was able to capture that moment for folks because it really is such an incredible moment to, especially for Indigenous communities, to be in one room together and to be invited to the White House. You know, the White House is the center, the head of of a country that committed genocide against our nations, that tried to erase us, that tried to kill us, that um, actively was in war with our nations, and for us to be there, I think one of the best things that I heard somebody say was that for one night the White House was native land, and I think that that encapsulates exactly how I felt in that moment. You know, there are a lot of complex feelings around it, especially because a lot of people from our community wanted us to sort of boycott and not go to the event at all. But at the same time, I think that it is really important that, we are in those spaces and that we are there to have, to take up space. And I think that was also really important.
You know, one of our speakers for the first year of Widening the Pipeline was AC Agoyo of Indians.com. And he talked about being there as well and participating, but he also mentioned the fact that in some aspects, there weren't representatives from the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times, people jockeying to put this on their front pages or anywhere really in publication. So, talk about that sort of dichotomy or whatever the correct word is about making such a profound move forward in terms of access to covering policy and political issues, but also still in some ways being marginalized.
Yeah, so I think that I'll just tell this little story. So I went to go cover the swearing in ceremony of Mary Peltola after Don Young had passed away unexpectedly. And so I was allowed a one-time, pass, temporary pass to go cover that because funny enough, ICT does not have a press pass for either Capitol Hill or the White House. And we've been working for years to get that done. It's been an ongoing issue because of the way that we get funding. And so we get funding from tribal nations who have lobbyists. And for that reason, you know, there's a lot of rules around that. And I think that it makes it extremely hard for tribal nations, especially newsrooms who are, they're not run by tribal nations, but they're under the umbrella of a tribal nation, for us to get these passes to go into these spaces. And so I just want to bring awareness for folks about that, these rules that the press office has deeply impacts Indigenous reporters' access to these spaces that we really need to be in. And so I was really lucky that because it was such a historic event that they were like, we'll let you go. And so I was able to be in the press for that event. And there was a woman, I'm sorry, I always say this, I shouldn't say that. There's a person from the New York Times uh, who came up to me and was like, "Oh my gosh, are you Pauly Denetclaw?" And I was like, "Yeah, I am." And this person was like, I read your stuff because I don't really understand any issues that are any policies that are related to Indigenous nations. I went to a Senate Indian Affairs Committee once and I didn't understand anything that was happening there. And I didn't understand what they were saying. And so for that reason, I don't cover the Senate Indian Affairs. And she was their Hill correspondent. And so I think that this encapsulates sort of the experience of what it means. Politico, I know that folks from Politico read my stuff. I know that people from the New York Times read my reporting. And I know that a lot of reporters in this space here in DC don't understand tribal, like Indigenous policy. And so I have a really great opportunity here to be able to not only educate, you know, folks who read our work at ICT, but I also have the opportunity to educate other reporters and peers in my industry who may not understand tribal nations, who don't understand tribal sovereignty, who don't understand the way that tribal governments work. And so I just really want to make sure that folks are aware that to be Native American is a political identity. It's not a racial identity. We are sovereign Native nations within the United States. We have our own presidents. We have our own councils. We have our own laws, our own governments. We have our own justice systems. We have our own culture, language. We are independent nations within the United States. And so we have treaties, which are the highest law of the land according to our Constitution. And we have a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States. And so when we're talking about Indigenous issues, we have to talk about tribal sovereignty, which is understanding that tribal nations are sovereign Native nations. And so that's the issue that happens when people who don't understand tribal sovereignty report on policies because they don't understand the very foundation of what that even means. And then we get terrible reporting that sort of likens what it means to be Native American to a racial identity. And then we see court cases like the Indian Child Welfare Act being challenged, saying that it's a race-based law when it's not. It's a law that is for tribal nations. It's rooted in nationhood in the same way that America has a say over the children in this country. Like tribal nations also have a say in what happens to the children of their nation. And there are certain laws that have to be put into place and how children are, you know, either adopted or not adopted um, out of this country, leaving this country. And so that has to, people have to understand that when they're reporting on tribal nations and tribal policy.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to open it up to questions from the fellows soon, so get those Zoom hands up. But before we do that, I want to explore that a little bit more with you, Pauly, in that as journalists, particularly those affiliated with legacy media, we do have the imperative of staying abreast of the news and breaking news events and trends and whatever. It seems to me that as an Indigenous journalist covering policy in the US, you have sort of a double uh, load or obligation in that not only are you covering breaking news events policy wise from Congress, et cetera, but you have the responsibility of educating the public and providing a baseline of knowledge. Tell us about how does that add to your stress? Does it add to your challenges?
I think when I first started in this position, I did feel a lot of pressure to sort of be the person who was educating folks and making sure that people understood and that I was rooting everything in context. And it was extremely overwhelming when I first, moved from my local newspaper into a more regional newspaper, which was the Texas Observer, and making sure that even though I will say this, my work is the focus of my work is not for non-native people. The focus of my work is for native people. And when I write my articles, no matter where I write it is for native people. And that is always the center of what I do and sort of my ethos and my work. And but in order to make it broad and accessible for the general public as well, because that's also part of my job as a journalist. And so I put in all of those extra pieces. And I also think that it's important for my community to also be reminded of like, oh yeah, this is why things are the way that they are, because I exist in a world where things are that's just how they are. And I didn't really understand, tribal sovereignty or what that meant until I went to my Native American Studies program at UNM, which is the best in the country. And I was able to have professors who looked like me, who were from my community. Most of them were Navajo. And I got to learn about my history and law and policy from them. And so being able to have a really firm foundation in tribal law and policy from experts in this field who are also Indigenous was incredible. It changed my entire reporting. And so I think that that's what I do is I root my stories. My stories are for Indigenous people, but I root it in history and context is what I always say. And so I make sure that people understand what tribal sovereignty is. I make sure that people understand that we have a nation to nation relationship. I talk about treaty rights. I explain what those are. And so it was a lot at the beginning, but now it's just like I have this sort of like general paragraph that I kind of just like throw in every single time and making sure that people understand why, you know, we are nation to nationhood, why the federal government is obligated, mandated by its own law to provide treaty rights and what those treaty rights are, what they look like, what treaties we're actually talking about when we're talking about specific tribal nations. For the Navajo Nation, it's the Treaty of 1868. And in there, there are laws that we, the Navajo Nation, and the Attorney General uses all the time in cases. They cite the Treaty of 1868 in cases to this day. And they also go after folks using that treaty because we have the bad man clause, which basically means that anybody who is perpetuating like I wouldn't say like violence, but like who are trying to scam or do like those types of things to Navajo people, the Navajo Nation has the right to sue those people. And so my the Navajo Nation is suing, auto sellers, um, folks who are trying to take advantage of Native people, I guess is the way that is the best way to describe that clause. And so, yeah, I think that It was very overwhelming at the beginning, but now it's much easier. And it also kind of scares me too sometimes because I know that very powerful policymakers, affluent people in the government read my reporting, and that's really scary. But at the same time, I also feel really glad that I'm the person that they are going to read these stories because they're getting the full story and not just part of it. And so I keep that in mind as well as I'm reporting. I'm like, okay, I need to explain how this is happening and why this is happening, not just the straight facts of a situation. I have to root all of my reporting in context.
Powerful stuff. I mean, considering, as you say, you are aware that powerful people are reading your content and trying to learn about these issues that must put pressure. But one question that I wanted to ask you was about this issue of trauma as a person of color. I in our last conversation, I talked with Tolu Olorunipa about this issue of covering politics on January 6th in
Mm,
Washington, D.C. as an African American man.
mm.
And I know that I recall sitting on my couch at home and being frozen really in horror as I watched what happened. And so I want to ask you, as a Indigenous journalist, as a woman who has a firm grasp on the history of policies in this country and just basically the way things have turned out, how do you grapple with that, particularly when you're having interactions with powerful people and folks at the White House? And how do you sort of unpack that and deal with it and move forward?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really the way that I like to describe this is all of these institutions that exist. I live here in Capitol Hill. I live literally a 10-minute walk away from the Capitol. I can see it from here. The Hart buildings are right next to me. Um, and I think that when I first got here to DC, every single thing that was here, you know, the buildings, the brick, the white marble everywhere, the white buildings everywhere, all of the street names, all of the statues, everything that existed here in this space was a reminder of all of the violence and death and the celebration of that in our nation's capital really, really was sickening to me for a long time. And it was something that I did have to grapple with and understand and come to terms with because, me and my friend likes to go and watch the sunrise at the Lincoln Memorial. And Lincoln, um, he sentenced a lot of Indigenous people to be hanged for no reason. Um, I think it was the most amount of Native people who were sentenced to death by a president, and that is really traumatic to know. And every year on that anniversary, Indigenous people talk about that, and so it's very challenging. But I think one of the things that really changed my perspective is I actually have it here. Um, is this book here. It's called Indigenous DC. It's Native People and the Nation's Capital. It's written by a Native woman. Her name's Elizabeth Rule. And one of the most powerful things in this book is it said that Indigenous people have always come to our nation's capital. Indigenous people have always made the trek, you know, thousands of miles to come here and to advocate for their people. There are tribal leaders who are buried here in DC because they got sick and they passed away here. Um, they're, and so to know that there are people here who gave their lives to come and advocate for their people, to come to advocate for their nations is extremely powerful. And to know that we've done that from the very beginning. from the inception of this country, Indigenous people have always been engaged in policy and politics. And I now am part of that legacy of Indigenous people who come here, who ask leaders, these questions, these tough questions, who share that knowledge back home, who make that accessible for our nations, for our leaders across the country. And I also want everybody to know that the Cherokee Phoenix is older than the New York Times, and it is the oldest tribal newspaper in the country. And they've been doing this longer than anyone. And so sharing information, reporting has always been a part of Indigenous nations. And so I think that that's really something that I think about and I hold on to, and I that keeps me grounded. And I'm really lucky that our tribal leaders come here, and I know them from back home. I covered them while I was back at Navajo Times. And so I see them here, and it just is, again, that reminder that our people have always done this, and that sort of keeps me grounded.
Are there any questions before I keep going with my questions? I don't see any. Caroline,
Caroline.
Caroline, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Caroline Colvin. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a DEI reporter for HR Dive, occupying Piscataway land. My question is about sourcing. So in my job, I feel like I try to do my due diligence with like not just talking to Black people, but talking to Asian folks and Hispanic Latinx folks. And I want to talk to more Indigenous people, but I think it's not that I haven't reached out, but I'm like afraid of being like extractive in a way. And I don't know, like recreating like cellular dynamics. So I guess my question is like, do you have any advice for reaching out to Indigenous folks and just kind of emphasizing like, I want to pass the mic and like center y'all's voices and not be extractive with your stories?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Caroline. I think it is very challenging to not feel like that. I think I've grappled with that for a long time, um, especially because I don't want to be extractive in the work that I do as well. And stories are resources, and we say that all the time at the Indigenous Journalist Association. And so one of the things that I think is really important is just making sure that the stories are centered on what folks um, what their perspectives is. And so obviously I work for an Indigenous news outlet, so it's much easier for me to be able to do that. But when I report on stories about tribal policy, especially when they're happening at hearings, I oftentimes don't talk to any of the members of Congress. If I want to quote them, I just sort of go back and whatever they're saying during the hearing, I quote, but I do interviews with Indigenous people about why they're there. I talk with tribal leaders, I talk with representatives, and I think that doing that is a way to include folks. I One of the things that I would shy away from is just arts and culture reporting. I do not like, not that I don't like it, it's all people do. It's all they do. Everything that folks do is like arts and culture. It's, oh, this art exhibit is opening in DC. Oh, this like march is happening here. This powwow is happening here. This like Native American Heritage Month thing is happening here. I specifically don't do any Native American Heritage Month reporting, specifically because I'm encouraging people to do their Native coverage all year round. So I don't engage in that anymore with obviously non-native news outlets. I do that with my news outlet because we're by natives for natives. So it's different, but I think that that's the way to do it, is seeing Native people in the totality versus seeing them in only one way, which is arts and culture.
Any other questions? Raise a hand so that I can see if there are. If not, I'm going to jump in and ask about, again, this critically important election year, where legacy media has sort of defined what the key issues are, and a lot of them deal with the tensions and fractures in American society, black and white, et cetera. Uh, so because you're a publication aimed at a specific audience, what is your coverage strategy for this election year? Tell us about some of the key issues that you're focusing on.
Yeah, so this year, my focus is talking to Indigenous leaders, Indigenous voters. That is the focus for me, because oftentimes I think that, I don't want to say that it's bad reporting, but I think there is issue, there's hot topic issues that national news outlets, they like because it's catchy, it's newsworthy, it's something different to them. And so we hear a lot about missing and murdered Indigenous people. That's a huge one that folks outside of, I think, my community really focus on as one of the top issues that exists for Indigenous people. And while it definitely is, a very important issue to a lot of people. Um, there's recently Cole Brings Plenty, who was found murdered. He's an actor, and he went to Haskell Indian Nations University in Kansas, and he was found dead. And so these are real issues, and they're really important to my community, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say my community, are really important to Indigenous nations. But at the same time, there are over 500 Indigenous nations in this country, and they all have different issues. And the focus for my coverage this year is making sure that all of these nations feel as though their issues are being spoken to in some fashion or another, whether it's through their own nation or a nation that is close to them, a nation that is in their region who has similar issues. And so, for example, I did a story in South Carolina about the only federally recognized tribe, the Catawba Nation, and talked with them about some of the issues that they're facing, and which is different than my nation, obviously. And so they had a real big emphasis on making sure that they're doing a lot of language revitalization. Culture revitalization is huge to them. And then also getting money for healthcare was a big one for them as well. And those are not issues that I would say would be at the top for the Navajo Nation, where the top issue is infrastructure, roads, having paved roads for people to drive on. I think the last that I checked, it was 80% of roads on the Navajo Nation are unpaved. And so infrastructure is a huge issue for the Navajo Nation. And it does cause a lot of issues because, especially when it rains or when it snows, people can't leave their homes because the mud is so thick. And that causes a whole host of other issues when it comes to folks who are experiencing medical issues, who are experiencing violence in their homes, who are dealing with all of these issues and they can't get help. And so I think that in general, the big thing is fully funding Indian Health Services. It's making sure that the other issue that I keep hearing over and over and over again is the grant process for the federal government. That needs to be changed in order to allow tribal governments to have more say in how they use federal dollars. And right now, it's sort of like the federal government saying to tribal nations, this is how you're going to use your money. This is how the program is going to be structured. This is how it's going to fit into your community. And tribal nations are like, it doesn't work for my community, but we need this money. So we'll go ahead and follow that. And then the program is not successful. And it's because it's not built to be successful for this specific tribal nation. And so grant writing is a huge thing that I keep hearing over and over and over again. And then in general, there is just an underfunding of every Native specific service for the federal government. And that also it just needs to be funded. It needs to be fully funded. I don't know how that happens. I don't know what needs to go on, but that seems to be the biggest issues.
Well, since you mentioned that, let's talk about the presence of Secretary Holland now in the cabinet. And I wonder if there is a danger of people pointing to that and saying, well, we've come that far and we have a Native cabinet secretary, so we can wash our hands of any responsibility. What has that been like for you covering her presence, and what do you think it might mean in terms of policies?
I think that specifically being a Native news outlet, one of the things that has been interesting for me is that the in general, the Native community celebrates Deb Haaland and all that she's done and all that she represents, um, without also recognizing that there could be more done and she could be doing more. And so it's a balance for me in terms of pointing out all the things that she hasn't done, and then also all the things that she has done. And it also, I guess, becomes challenging for me in that folks, especially from Indigenous nations, when it comes to sort of grant dollars and funding for programming, um, in the context of things, in the context of the government, $100,000 is not a lot of money. It doesn't go a long ways. And so when we see all of this money getting funneled into Indigenous nations, and it's at $100,000 here, $100,000 there, $50,000 here, that to me is meaningless, because what does that pay for one person's position? Like, what does that do? What does that do in terms of infrastructure? How much of that actually, what does it do? It costs $1 million to pave a mile of road. So that's what I think about. Um, and also making sure that folks from our community know that Deb Haaland is the Secretary of the Interior, but so in general, she represents the entire nation. She represents the president. She doesn't really, you know, she's in the room, she's having those conversations, but at the end of the day, whatever the president and his administration wants is what she is going to do. And so we saw that with the Willow Project. President Biden signed 3 of the 5 proposed projects, and she got a lot of heat for that because she ran specifically for Congress, saying that she was against all of these oil and gas development. And now here she is, where her department is approving huge leases that go against her own personal values, that we've seen in Congress. And, I think it's spoke volumes when she wasn't the one to sign those. She had somebody else do it from her administration at the Interior. And so it's a balance of trying to hold Secretary Haaland accountable, but also making sure that folks know that she is in a bind. She's in a tough spot.
It's an
And
important lesson about context, providing readers and media consumers with that kind of context. So thank you for that. There are no other major questions. I don't see any hands at the moment. I'm going to ask, I see a hand from Julian. Julian, introduce yourself.
Uh, Hey, Pauly. I'm Julian Sarapu. I'm a reporter at the Boston Globe. I want to ask you, for those of us who work at, local and regional papers, how do you suggest we go about, building better relationships with the Native people in our communities, and incorporating that into our coverage? Or is it something where, maybe we aren't the best people to do it? What's kind of your take on that, I guess?
I think that it's really important that my push is that everybody should have an Indigenous Affairs desk, especially if you're somebody like the Boston Globe. Like there should definitely be somebody covering um, Indigenous nations and stuff that are specific to Indigenous nations, especially I think Boston is like 30 minutes. I think there's like 2 or 3 tribal nations that are like within 30 minutes of Boston. Um, and so I think that there are a lot of stories that go untold because there's just nobody there covering them. And, tribal newspapers are very few and far between. There are very few Indigenous affairs desks. And so my preference would be that there is an Indigenous affairs reporter. But if that does not exist, then I would definitely encourage folks who are interested in covering Indigenous affairs to go ahead and do that and to take that up. I think there are a lot of great stories that are just not being told. And so one of the things that I think is really important if you're going to do Indigenous affairs coverage, and my biggest tip is for the Indigenous Journalist Association, we have this bingo card. It's called Reporting in Indian Country Edition. And it looks like this. And it has like all of the stereotypes and tropes that a lot of non-native national news outlets point to. And so if you have any of these in your story, then this little card here says, go ahead and rewrite that. Go ahead and do that story differently. And so a lot of this is like alcohol, dancing, a warrior, sexual assault, vanishing culture, unemployment, something sacred, a casino, drugs, reference to the ancestors, horses, spirits or ghosts, diabetes, addiction, violence, poverty, plight, broken families, drumming, dying language, a reservation, singing, poor education, and suicide. And so these are the only things that people tend to report on. And there is so much more that exists. And I think I prove that every single week with my reporting and my coverage that, you can report on Indigenous nations from the perspective of venture capital, from international trade, from Congress, the Supreme Court, from the White House. There are so many stories that exist. You can do music, hip hop, pop artists and TV shows. And, there's just all of these things that exist that are outside of sort of these stereotypes of Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations. And so I would start there. We also have, through the Indigenous Journalist Association, we have the Tribal Media Guide. And so the Tribal Media Guide basically tells you, like, if you want to do Indigenous affairs coverage and you want to do it really well, here are a list of 25 questions you should answer or should be able to answer if you want to do that kind of reporting. And it just gives you like a sort of like a broader perspective of how tribal nations work. And it helps you to like answer those questions. And then lastly, I'm pretty sure you could fact check me. But Boston has an Indian Center. So they have an American Indian Center in Boston. And I know that they're very active. If I'm not mistaken, I swear it's Boston. And so that's a great place to start. The other two is that there's like the Mashpee Wampanoag. And then there's another Wampanoag tribe that is really close to Boston, who have their own specific issues to talk about. You know, they're in they have such unique and interesting issues that I think would be great to explore.
Pauly, we have come near the end of our time with you, but I want to ask you before we let you go about the Indigenous Journalists Association and what the plans are in terms of elevating and amplifying the organization, and perhaps are there plans to try to collaborate with the other affinity groups?
Yeah, so the Indigenous Journalists Association, we So also, I just want everybody to know that we changed the name. It was not for political reasons. It was not us making a statement on Native American. We changed our name because we are expanding globally. And so we are now expanding into Canada and getting membership in Canada. And folks in Canada do not identify as Native American. And so it is purely to bring in more folks into our organization because folks from Canada thought they could not be a part of our organization. Native Hawaiians did not think that they could be a part of our organization. And just a lot of Indigenous people from who are in the United States, but are from other countries felt as though they could not be a part of our organization because they are not Native American. And so we wanted to create an inclusive space of all Indigenous people and welcoming them into our organization. And so that's why we did the name change, was for those reasons. And so we have worked in the past with the Native, what is it? National NAHJ?
National Association of Hispanic Journalists.
Yeah. So we were part of that. And then obviously when Unity existed, we were a part of that. And so we did a co-conference with NAHJ a few years ago. We haven't done that in a while though, but that's specifically because we pick our conference locations based upon what our membership wants. And so it gives us more freedom to be able to choose a location that works for our membership, because oftentimes they're dealing with budget. It has to be low cost so that our people can go. And so that's kind of what we keep in mind as we're picking this. But of course, IJA is very open to working and collaborating with other affinity groups. And we also welcome non-Native folks into our organization. There's an associate level membership that non-Native folks can pay for and be a part of, and come join us at IJA.
I think I'm going to do that almost as soon as we hang up this call. Pauly, this has been an incredibly informative and powerful conversation that you've shared with our Widening the Pipeline fellows. So as I did with our last guest, I want to welcome you to the Widening family. We're going to be calling on you and having you join us again. So thank you so much for taking time out to talk with us today.
Of course. And please email me, pauly@ictnews.org. If any of you want to connect, I'm here. I'm here to be helpful. So if any of you all need anything, have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I will help you as much as I can.
We will. You take care, and I'll be in touch soon.
Okay. All right. Bye. Have a good day.